Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 28th of December 2020 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today has been presented on your screen. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. Now before starting the today's discussion, please test yourself through these questions. The response to these questions has been presented at the end of the video discussion. Now this particular article appears on page number 7 and is titled as The Facade Cracks for China. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 2 International Relations. What is the meaning of the title of this particular article? Now if you look at the word facade, facade basically refers to a false or a deceptive appearance that makes someone more pleasant or better than they actually are. Imagine you have a friend whom you consider to be good, kind-hearted and a kind of perfect human being. But in reality, he could be cunning, dishonest or highly manipulative. That is the meaning of facade. Now if you combine the two words, facade cracks. Now this means that you get to know the true personality of your friend. That is, when you get to know that he is not the perfect human being that you imagine him to be. Now the article here is with reference to China. See, China keeps on proclaiming that it is following the doctrine of the peaceful rise since 1990s. By openly highlighting that it is following such a policy, China wants to assure the international community that its growing economic and geopolitical might will not affect the interest of the other countries. But this is what China says. Do you think China even today it is following such a policy? Now according to some of the experts, post COVID-19, China has given up the policy of peaceful rise and instead adopted the wolf warrior diplomacy. In this regard, this article has highlighted that finally the facade of China has got cracked. Accordingly, based upon our discussion, a main question for your practice here could be: do you think the policy of peaceful rise adopted by China in its foreign policy has come to an end post COVID-19? Give arguments in support of your answer. So as part of this particular video analysis, we'll understand the policy of peaceful rise and why this policy of peaceful rise has given way to the wolf warrior diplomacy, some of the important characteristics of wolf warrior diplomacy and its implications in terms of domestic policy, foreign policy, as well as economic policy. See, when the Tiananmen Square protests took place in China way back in 1989, China's global image as a responsible and citizen-friendly government took a hit. Accordingly, in response, China started developing the policy of peaceful rise in 1990s and it finally got crystallized at the start of the 21st century under the regime of Hu Jintao. In the year 2005, the Chinese government published a white paper highlighting the peaceful development strategy. It outlined a number of strategies that the Chinese government would follow. For example, it highlighted that it is in favor of multipolar world rather than hegemony. It will remain open to the outside world for the trade and it will try to promote democracy in the international relations. That means it will interact with all the countries on equal footing and it will try to resolve the disputes through multilateralism rather than coercion. So basically, through the adoption of such a doctrine, China wanted to assure the international community that its growing economic, political and military power would not be a threat to the international community. So through such a policy, China wanted to show to the international community that it is a responsible world power. It will focus more on soft power rather than hard power. It is committed to its own internal issues before interfering in the international affairs. It wanted to show to the international community that if China is getting developed, even other countries would also get benefited. And it also focused upon the peaceful resolution of border disputes, both land disputes as well as the maritime disputes. According to some of the political experts, this particular policy of peaceful rise has now given way to the wolf warrior diplomacy, especially after the COVID-19. Now, wolf warrior diplomacy basically means a shift in the diplomacy from being conservative, passive, and low key to an assertive, proactive, and high profile diplomacy. Now, if you look at the word wolf warrior, the word basically comes from a 2015 Chinese movie by the same name. The movie plot basically involves a group of Chinese soldiers who go out of China and carry out offensive attacks in the enemy countries. It is similar to what you see in the Rambo movies in Hollywood, or for that matter, the Uri movie in India. Now, the Chinese diplomats have taken inspiration from this particular movie. The evidence of such a wolf warrior diplomacy can be seen in the adoption of a strong and offensive diplomatic posture, especially against countries such as US, Australia, India, Japan, etc. Now, for example, when the coronavirus was being labeled as Wuhan virus in USA, and when China was increasingly facing the international backlash over the Wuhan virus, a high-level Chinese diplomat tweeted that it might be the US Army who brought the epidemic to Wuhan. Similarly, when the country started questioning the substandard exports of face masks and the protective gear from China, instead of improving their quality, a Chinese diplomat tweeted that if they're finding these products to be of substandard quality, then the international community should stop using these products. So this clearly shows that the diplomacy in case of China has become highly assertive, proactive, as well as high profile. So through the adoption of such a policy, the Chinese diplomats want to counter the growing anti-China sentiment or the growing anti-China narrative which has come into being post-COVID-19. They would now want to defend China's interest in a confrontational manner rather than in a diplomatic manner. And as far as resolution of border disputes is concerned, now China has become highly aggressive with respect to resolution of such border disputes. Now, these phases of wolf warrior diplomacy can be seen in terms of domestic policy, foreign policy, as well as the economic policy. As far as the domestic policy is concerned, as you must be aware, China has become highly assertive as far as Hong Kong and Taiwan is concerned. Now, as discussed in our previous DNS videos, Hong Kong is a special administrative region within China because of its British legacy. However, China has effectively tried to curb the autonomy by passing a series of legislations which has in turn ignited serious protest across Hong Kong. It has introduced the extradition law, national security law, and expulsion of the lawmakers. The extradition law would enable the local governments to extradite criminals to mainland China. The national security law effectively curbed the dissent and civil liberties in Hong Kong. And the expulsion of lawmakers, this law empowers the Chinese government to expel the lawmakers in the Hong Kong's Legislative Council without any recourse to the judicial process. As far as Taiwan is concerned, China has been trying to assert its sovereignty over Taiwan by using the military means. For example, the Chinese J-10 fighter jets have repeatedly been entering into Taiwan's airspace, and by doing so, they have been trying to assert their sovereignty over Taiwan. Prior to this, China used to assert its sovereignty over Taiwan only through diplomatic means, but now it has adopted aggressive means. As far as the foreign policy is concerned, we do know that China is presently involved in a border dispute with India. The buildup of Chinese troops, armaments, etc. is considered to be at unprecedented scale across the line of actual control. Now, even prior to this, India and China were involved in a number of border disputes in the past, but usually such border disputes used to be solved peacefully through the diplomatic means, and this time it may be difficult to find a peaceful resolution to such a dispute. Similarly, China has also been aggressive over the territorial claims in South China Sea. See, as part of the peaceful rise, China stated that it will try to promote democracy in the international relations and it will try to resolve the international disputes through multilateral forum. But as you can see in the South China Sea, rather than resolving the disputes through multilateral forum, China has been adopting the unilateral ways in order to change the status quo in the South China Sea. The relationship between China and Australia have also got deteriorated. When COVID-19 occurred, Australia wanted to start an international probe over the origin of the COVID-19. In response, immediately China decided to put trade curbs on Australia and decided to limit the import of goods from Australia. And as you must be aware, the relationship between US and China is at all-time low on account of number of factors including the trade war. As far as the economic policy is concerned, recently Chinese government has unveiled its new economic policy. As part of such a new economic policy, the Chinese government has outlined that it would shift from the international circulation to the dual circulation. See, when we say international circulation, as you must be aware, Chinese economy so far is basically an export-led economy. That is, it has been able to grow at phenomenal GDP growth rate by boosting its exports. But now, the Chinese government believes that it can no longer sustain higher exports in order to have higher GDP growth rate. This is on account of number of factors such as the anti-China sentiment, the ongoing trade war, the rising protectionist policies across the world, and so on. Accordingly, instead of focusing on international circulation, now the Chinese government wants to focus on dual circulation. See, the main idea of the dual circulation is to make China less dependent on the world and make the world more dependent on China. The dual circulation here basically refers to the internal circulation and the external circulation. Internal circulation means to boost the local demand and achieve higher GDP growth rate. External circulation would entail boosting of exports, building supply chains which are completely independent of other countries. Now this becomes quite important because even though China is an integral part of the global supply chains, the total amount of value addition that takes place in China is quite less. So in future, China wants to build the entire supply chains on its own without the help of other countries. It also has sought to integrate itself into the global economy by signing large number of free trade agreements. We do know that recently China has become part of the comprehensive regional economic partnership. So going forward, China would want to become part of a large number of FTAs in order to make the world more dependent on China. So this is how there has been a paradigm shift in the policy of China from that of peaceful rise to the wolf warrior diplomacy. This is what you have to know with respect to this particular article. With this, let us now take up the next article. Now, this particular article appears on page number 10 and is titled as Serum Institute of India to launch the pneumonia vaccine. This article shall be important from the perspective of prelims, science and technology. Apart from that, this particular article is also important because as you can see in prelims 2020, there was a direct question related to the importance of using the pneumococcal conjugate vaccines in India. See, pneumonia, which basically causes the infection of the lungs, it is considered to be one of the major reasons for the under 5 mortality across the world as well as India. In the year 2015, 1 out of 6 childhood deaths across the world were attributed to pneumonia. This roughly translates into 1 million childhood deaths per year, 2,500 childhood deaths per day, 100 childhood deaths per hour, and 1 childhood death per every 35 seconds. As far as India is considered, pneumonia and diarrhea are considered to be the major reasons for the under 5 mortality rate. India has a pneumonia mortality rate of almost around 7 per 1000 live births. Hence, in order to reduce the under 5 mortality caused due to pneumonia, the government of India had then introduced the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine in the year 2017 as part of the universal immunization program. However, the problem here is these vaccines presently are manufactured by 2 foreign companies, and moreover, these vaccines are available at a higher price. That means India has so far failed to develop a indigenously developed pneumococcal conjugate vaccine. Now, this article highlights that the Serum Institute of India is set to launch India's first indigenously developed pneumococcal conjugate vaccine. Already the Serum Institute of India has been given the regulatory approval for the launch of this particular vaccine. Hence, accordingly, keeping in mind the importance of this particular article, let us discuss various aspects related to pneumonia as well as the newly launched pneumococcal conjugate vaccine. So let us first understand the what, why and how of pneumonia. See, pneumonia as discussed before refers to the infection of the lungs. See, the air that you breathe in either through the nose or the mouth, it enters into the lungs through the trachea. In the lungs, we do have the air sacs which are referred to as the alveoli. It is through the alveoli that the exchange of gases takes place between the air and the bloodstream. So in case of pneumonia, this alveoli, instead of being filled up with air, it gets filled up with pus as well as fluid. This in turn makes it difficult for the person who is infected with the pneumonia to breathe, and moreover the oxygen intake into the human body also reduces. This pneumonia can be caused by bacteria, virus or a fungi. The most common forms of bacteria that causes a pneumonia include the Streptococcus pneumonia as well as the Haemophilus influenza type B bacteria. Please do note that the Streptococcus pneumonia not only causes pneumonia but it also causes various other infectious diseases. It causes the meningitis. Meningitis basically refers to the infection in the membrane that covers the brain as well as the spinal cord. It causes the infection of the middle ear. It causes the infection in the nose. It also causes the infection in the bloodstream. Even the Haemophilus influenza type B bacteria also causes the meningitis apart from causing the pneumonia. The bacteria, virus and the fungi that causes a pneumonia can be transmitted either through airborne or the blood transfusion. Airborne means a person who is infected with the pneumonia, if he coughs or sneezes, then a normal person can get infected. As far as the blood transfusion is concerned, the bacteria can also get transmitted even during the birth. Pneumonia can affect the people of all the age groups, including the children, young as well as elderly. Children less than 5 years, especially less than 2 years, are considered to be high risk groups for the pneumonia. So the children who are not breastfed as well as the children who are considered to be malnourished are considered to be highly vulnerable groups. Even the children who are exposed to the indoor smoke are also considered to be high risk groups. As far as adults and elderly are concerned, the adults and elderly who have the weak immune system are considered to be high risk groups. It basically includes those people who have been infected with HIV, sickle cell diseases, people who are suffering from various renal diseases and so on are considered to be high risk groups. See, the vaccine that has been developed by Serum Institute of India, it is a pneumococcal conjugate vaccine. So how is a conjugate vaccine different from a weakened live vaccine? See, we all know as to how the vaccines work. The vaccines basically are used to trigger the immune response from the body so that in future when the actual microbe strikes the human body, the immune system is ready to defend itself. In case of the weakened live vaccine, we normally use the entire microbe which is weakened or killed in order to trigger the immune response. However, in case of conjugate vaccine, instead of using the entire microbe, we use a specific part of the microbe. We can either use a specific protein or we can use a specific sugar which is associated with the microbe in order to trigger the immune response. So the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine that is developed by the Serum Institute of India does not use the weakened live vaccine of the Streptococcus pneumonia. Rather, it uses a specific sugar which is associated with the Streptococcus pneumonia in order to trigger the immune response. That is why it is referred to as a conjugate vaccine. See, one benefit of using the conjugate vaccine over and above the weakened live vaccine here is, in case of conjugate vaccine, we use a specific part of the microbe which in turn enables us to have a targeted immune response. So the conjugate vaccines as such can even be used in the people who have the weak immune system. However, if we use the weakened live vaccine in the people who have the weak immune system, then it can have adverse implications. Moreover, as discussed before, the Streptococcus pneumonia bacteria also causes sepsis, meningitis as well as sinusitis. Hence, the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine can also provide vaccination for even these infectious diseases as well. Now, coming to certain details about the Universal Immunization Program or the Mission Indradhanush, which can become quite important from the perspective of the UPSC examination. See, the Universal Immunization Program seeks to provide vaccines free of cost against 12 diseases, 9 diseases at the national level and 3 diseases at the sub-national level. The diseases that are covered at the national level include diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus, polio, measles, rubella, severe form of childhood tuberculosis, hepatitis B, and meningitis and pneumonia, which is basically caused by the Haemophilus influenza type B bacteria. Subnationally, it provides protection against the 3 diseases. These 3 diseases include the rotavirus diarrhea, pneumococcal pneumonia, and Japanese encephalitis. So these are some of the important aspects which one should know with respect to this particular article. With this, let us now take up the next article. Next, on page number 8, we have an article which highlights that the government of Telangana is set to borrow almost up to rupees 1000 crores through the issuance of the state development loans. Now, in our DNS dated 17 July 2020, I have discussed the various sources of borrowing for both central government as well as state government. We have discussed about the various tools used by the governments such as the cash management bills, ways and means advances, treasury bills, and so on. So what I would do here is I would attach the previous DNS video for your revision. Those of you who have already revised these concepts, I suggest you to skip to the next article. Now, as you all must be aware, the fiscal deficit corresponds to the total amount of borrowings by the government in a single year. The fiscal deficit is usually expressed in terms of percentage of GDP. Now, for example, for the present financial year, the government has estimated the fiscal deficit to be at 3.5% of India's GDP. Now, considering the fact that the nominal GDP of India in the financial year 2019-20 was approximately equal to, so if you convert 3.5% of the India's GDP, that is 204 lakh crore into absolute value, it would be almost around 8 lakh crore. So 8 lakh crore is what the government has planned to borrow for the present financial year. However, we all know that because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the government is not being able to meet the borrowing targets and it is required to borrow more amount of money in order to provide for a fiscal stimulus. Nevertheless, keeping this aside, let us understand as to what are the various sources of borrowing for the government of India. So as you can see here, the government can borrow both long-term loans as well as short-term loans. With respect to short-term loans, one of the most dominant source for raising the short-term loans is through the issuance of the treasury bills. Now, through the issuance of treasury bill, the government can borrow the short-term loans from the market. Now, the maturity period of the treasury bill is of different periods such as 91 days, 182 days, 364 days. So, depending upon the maturity period of the treasury bill, we can have 3 different types of T-bills, that is T91, T182 or T364. Now, please do note that these treasury bills are actually zero coupon securities. That means they do not carry any interest. They are usually issued at discount, but they are redeemed at face value. Let us understand this mechanism through a simple example. Let's say the face value of a particular treasury bill is rupees 100 and you have bought this particular treasury bill at a discount value of rupees 97. So you have not bought the treasury bill at its face value, but you have bought it at its discounted value of rupees 97. So upon the maturity of such a treasury bill, you would be getting back a value which is equal to the face value of the treasury bill. So for you, the profit here is rupees 3. So this rupees 3 in a way can be considered to be a kind of interest on the treasury bill. However, as stated before, the treasury bills do not carry any interest and hence they are referred to as zero coupon securities. So whenever the government needs to borrow money from the market for a duration of greater than 91 days but less than 1 year, then the government can issue the treasury bill. The next financial instrument that the government can resort to is the ways and means advances. Now, under the ways and means advances, the government can borrow money from the Reserve Bank of India. So, unlike the treasury bill where the government is borrowing money from the market, under the ways and means advances, the government is borrowing money from the Reserve Bank of India. That is the first difference. The second difference here is the government can resort to ways and means advances from the Reserve Bank of India only to meet its temporary mismatches in its cash balances. So the government cannot resort to ways and means advances in order to finance its deficit. Now recently the Reserve Bank of India has increased the borrowing limit of both the center and states under the ways and means advances in order to deal with the COVID-19 situation. Accordingly, this particular topic of ways and means advances becomes important for your upcoming prelims examination as well. So let us understand in detail about the ways and means advances as well. Now, as stated before, the ways and means advances can be resorted to both center as well as states in order to address their temporary mismatches in receipts and expenditure. Now, for example, let's say in the month of June, the government is said to receive an amount of rupees 200, but it is required to spend an amount which is equal to rupees 300. So here the government is having a shortage of rupees 100. Now let's say in the month of July, the government is said to receive an additional amount of rupees 100. So here for the month of June, the government is facing a temporary mismatch in its receipt and expenditure, and it cannot keep on waiting until the month of July in order to undertake an expenditure of rupees 300. So, in order to address this particular shortage of rupees 100, the government can resort to borrowing from the Reserve Bank of India through the ways and means advances. Now, the ways and means advances was actually introduced in the year 1997. Before the ways and means advances, the center and states used to issue the ad hoc treasury bills. Now, the problem with the ad hoc treasury bills was that the interest rate on the treasury bills was quite lower as compared to the existing repo rate. So, since the center and states were required to pay a lower rate of interest on the ad hoc treasury bills, they kept on issuing the ad hoc treasury bills in order to not only meet their temporary mismatch in their receipts and expenditure, but they also use the ad hoc treasury bills for undertaking their deficit financing as well. So the temporary nature of ad hoc treasury bills as such became both permanent as well as cumulative, and in the long run this led to financial indiscipline on the behalf of center and states. Hence, in order to address this particular problem, the ways and means advances was introduced in the year 1997. So under the present regime, the center and states can resort to ways and means advances only to address their temporary mismatches in the receipt and expenditure. They cannot resort to ways and means advances in order to finance their deficit. Now, for example, let's say the overall revenue receipts of the central government is around 1000 rupees, whereas the revenue expenditure is around rupees 1500. So here the government is having a deficit of rupees 500. Now this deficit of rupees 500 cannot be financed through the ways and means advances. The ways and means advances as such can be used only to address the temporary mismatches. So under the ways and means advances, both the center and states borrow from the RBI, but there is a limit on how much amount of money can be borrowed, and this particular limit is mutually decided by both the Reserve Bank of India and the concerned government. The interest rate on the ways and means advances is equal to the repo rate, and the duration as such is 90 days. So after the duration of 90 days, the center and the states will be required to return back the money which they have borrowed from the Reserve Bank of India under the ways and means advances. Apart from that, the center and state can also resort to overdraft. That means they can borrow over and above the limit which has been specified by the RBI and the government. However, if they are exceeding the limit specified by the RBI, then they would have to pay interest which is at least 2% higher than the repo rate. Next, coming to cash management bills. Now, the cash management bills can be issued by the government in order to borrow money in order to address their temporary mismatches in their cash balances. So, similar to ways and means advances, the cash management bills can be used in order to address a temporary mismatch. However, the difference here is that under the ways and means advances, the government is borrowing money from the Reserve Bank of India. However, under the cash management bill, the government is borrowing money from the market. Usually, the maturity period of the cash management bills is less than 90 days. So as you can see here, the cash management bills have certain features which are similar to treasury bills and certain features which are similar to ways and means advances. So just like ways and means advances, the cash management bills are issued in order to address the temporary mismatches. And similar to the treasury bills, the cash management bills are issued in the market. However, the minimum maturity period of the treasury bills is 91 days, but the maturity period of the cash management bill is less than 91 days. So please do remember two important things about the cash management bills. The first thing is that they are issued in order to address the temporary mismatches in the cash balances similar to the ways and means advances, but unlike the ways and means advances wherein the government is borrowing money from the RBI, under the cash management bill, the government is borrowing money from the market. The second feature here is, unlike the treasury bill whose maturity period is 91 days and above, the maturity period of the cash management bill is less than 90 days. As far as the long-term borrowings of the government is concerned, the government can borrow long-term loans through the issuance of the dated securities. The second one is securities against the National Small Savings Fund, special government securities such as recapitalization bonds, sovereign gold bonds, etc. The external borrowings, the receipts under the public account such as the State Provident Fund, etc. Now, as far as securities against the National Small Savings Fund, recapitalization bonds, external borrowings, etc. are concerned, all of these have been already explained in detail in our economic survey video analysis. Hence, we shall not be discussing these topics once again. I would advise you to go to the economic survey to have an understanding about these topics. Now, as far as the recapitalization bonds is concerned, through the recapitalization bonds, the government is borrowing money from the banks in order to undertake the recapitalization of the public sector banks. Now, as per the government, the money borrowed under recapitalization bonds would not be considered as part of fiscal deficit. Rather, it will be considered as part of the public debt of Government of India. Please note such a distinction, and this has already been explained in the economic survey video as well. Now, in case of India, the central government can resort to both short-term loans as well as the long-term loans. The short-term loans can be raised to the issuance of the treasury bills as well as the cash management bills. As far as the long-term loans is concerned, they can resort to the issuance of the dated securities. However, the state governments as such, they cannot raise the short-term loans to the issuance of the treasury bills. They can raise the short-term loans only to the issuance of the cash management bills. And as far as the long-term loans is concerned, the long-term loans can be raised by the state government through the issuance of the state development loans. So the state development loans are the financial instruments issued by the state government in order to raise the long-term loans. Now, this particular article appears on page number 10 and is titled as Inner Line Permit is the center's biggest gift to Manipur. See, earlier the Inner Line Permit was applicable to the three northeastern states of Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland and Mizoram. In December 2019, the central government decided to extend the Inner Line Permit system even to Manipur as well. In this regard, let us understand the various aspects of Inner Line Permit and its relationship with the Citizenship Amendment Act, which was passed with the Parliament last year. See, as you must be aware, the northeastern part of India is basically dominated by the tribals. So the influx of the illegal migrants from other countries or the migrants from the other Indian states into these northeastern states could have an adverse implications on their political, economic and social life of these tribals. For example, influx of large number of migrants into these northeastern states, it could affect their indigenous culture, their way of life, their language and so on. Influx of large number of migrants could lead to decrease in the employment opportunities of these tribals and so on. Hence, in order to protect the socio-economic and political interest of these tribals, the inner line permit system has been introduced. This system was earlier applicable to states of Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland and Mizoram, and in last year 2019 even Manipur has been brought under the inner line permit system. Under this inner line permit system, the outsiders will be required to take a permit from the state government in order to enter any designated territory. This permit is issued only for the purpose of travel. The concept of inner line permit was introduced by the British government under the Bengal Eastern Frontier Regulations 1873. So as discussed before, the main objective of the inner line permit is to provide for a special protection to the way of life of the tribals. Now this particular news related to inner line permit has been appearing in the newspaper repeatedly, mainly on account of two factors. First and foremost, after granting the inner line permit to Manipur, even the Meghalaya state government has been demanding for the inner line permit in order to protect its tribal population. However, the proposal put forward by the Meghalaya Assembly has so far not been accepted by the central government. Secondly, the Arunachal Pradesh, which is presently covered under the ILP system, it has recently stated that the inner line permit has failed to provide for adequate protection from the influx of the migrants. Accordingly, Arunachal Pradesh has been demanding for a special status under the Schedule 6 of the Indian Constitution. So as we can see in this particular map here, Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Manipur and Mizoram, all of these four states are protected under the inner line permit. Apart from that, under the 6th schedule of the Indian Constitution, some of the states in the northeastern part of India have also been provided with a special status. These states include Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura as well as Mizoram. However, as you can see here, the entire state of Assam is not covered under the Schedule 6 of the Indian Constitution. Typically, it is the Brahmaputra Valley which lie outside the 6th schedule. So it is basically the hilly areas in the Assam which have been given the protection under the 6th schedule of the Indian Constitution. Similarly, as you can see in this particular map, the entire state of Tripura has not been covered under the 6th schedule of the Indian Constitution. There are some parts of the Tripura state which is outside the 6th schedule. As far as Mizoram is concerned, certain areas in Mizoram have been given the protection under the inner line permit, whereas some areas have been given the protection under the 6th schedule of the Indian Constitution. So as you can see here, the Arunachal Pradesh, which is presently given the protection under the inner line permit, it has recently argued that the inner line permit has failed to provide adequate amount of protection from the influx of the migrants. So accordingly, Arunachal Pradesh has been demanding for its inclusion under the 6th schedule of the Indian Constitution. On the other hand, Meghalaya, which is presently protected under the Schedule 6 of the Indian Constitution, Meghalaya government believes that it has to be given the protection even under the inner line permit. And as far as Mizoram is concerned, Mizoram has been given protection both under 6th schedule of the Indian Constitution as well as the inner line permit. This is one aspect which becomes quite important from the perspective of the prelims examination. Now coming to the nature of relationship between the inner line permit and Citizenship Amendment Act. As you must be aware, the Citizenship Amendment Act passed by the Indian Parliament seeks to provide for the citizenship to the illegal migrants from the neighboring countries, particularly those migrants who have been the victims of the religious persecution. So the Citizenship Amendment Act seeks to provide the citizenship rights to the Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, Parsis or the Christian religious communities who have migrated from the neighboring countries, that is Afghanistan, Bangladesh and Pakistan. Now most of the illegal migrants from Bangladesh have actually settled in the northeastern part of India. So there was a genuine concern among the northeastern states that either central government extends the citizenship rights to these illegal migrants from Bangladesh, then this will affect the demography of the region and thus goes against the interests of the tribal communities. Hence, in order to address the concerns of the northeastern states, the Citizenship Amendment Act provides that this provision will not be applicable to the tribal areas of Assam, Meghalaya, Mizoram and Tripura, which have been included in the 6th schedule of the Indian Constitution. Not just the 6th schedule of the Indian Constitution, this exception will also be applicable to the states that are presently under the inner line permit. Now, for example, let's say there is a non-Muslim illegal migrant who is staying in Manipur. Now, this non-Muslim illegal migrant may be granted with the citizenship rights. Now, in spite of the fact that such an illegal migrant has been provided with a citizenship right, he will not be able to settle permanently in this particular area. Similarly, if an illegal migrant from a hilly areas in Assam, which is protected under the 6th schedule of the Indian Constitution, if such an illegal migrant is provided with the citizenship rights, he cannot continue to be settled there. So the part of the northeastern part of India where the Citizenship Amendment Act will continue to remain applicable is quite limited as shown in this particular diagram. This will be mainly confined to the Brahmaputra Valley and certain parts of the Barak Valley. That is why a lot of protests have been taking place in Assam in order to exclude even these areas from the ambit of the Citizenship Amendment Act. So this is what you have to know with respect to this particular article. With this, let us now take up the next article. Next on page number 3, there is an advertisement which highlights that the West Bengal government is set to develop a deep sea port at Tajpur, which is located in the East Midnapur district. See, presently in West Bengal, we have two ports, that is Kolkata as well as Haldia. However, both these ports are not deep sea ports, because of which they cannot handle large vessels. Accordingly, the West Bengal government has been trying to develop a deep sea port at Tajpur in partnership with the central government. However, because of some issues between the center and the states, now the West Bengal government has started to develop the deep sea port at Tajpur on its own. This particular port shall be developed in PPP mode, that is public private partnership mode. It will entail an investment of almost up to 15,000 crores. The construction of this deep sea port is set to create an employment opportunities of almost around 25,000. Now this particular topic becomes quite important because in prelims 2016 we had a question as to recently which of the following states has explored the possibility of constructing an artificial inland port to be connected by sea by a long navigational channel. The answer to this particular question was Rajasthan, wherein Rajasthan government had decided to construct an inland port at Jalore, and this inland port was proposed to be connected to the Arabian Sea through a long navigational channel. See, as far as UPSC prelims is concerned, you should have a basic understanding of the major and the minor ports and certain important details about the Sagarmala project. The management of the port sector in case of India has been laid down under both the Indian Constitution as well as the Indian Ports Act 1908. As per the Indian Constitution, the major ports have been placed under the Union list, whereas the minor ports have been placed under the concurrent list. Accordingly, the management of the major ports lies with the central government, whereas the management of the minor ports lies with the respective state governments. However, please do note that the Indian Constitution has not elaborated as to which ports are major ports and which ports are the minor ports. It is the Indian Ports Act 1908 which empowers the central government to declare some ports as a major ports. So all those ports which have been declared as a major ports, they would come under the control of the central government, whereas the remaining ports, they would remain under the control of the respective state government. See, way back in the year 2010, the central government had decided to declare even the Port Blair port as a major port. However, no concrete action has been taken by the central government so far. If you look at the annual report published by the Ministry of Shipping, the annual report mentions that there are 12 major ports in India. So in some of the sources which you probably see, you would come across the fact that there are 13 major ports. However, since the annual report of the Ministry of Shipping itself says that there are 12 major ports in India, we would have to go according to the government's publication and consider that there are 12 major ports and not 13 major ports. And as you can see here, 6 major ports are located along the western coast and 6 major ports are located along the eastern coast. The 12 major ports are Kandla Port, Mumbai Port, JNPT, Marmugao, New Mangalore, Cochin, Kolkata, Paradeep, Visakhapatnam, Ennore, Chennai, Chidambarnar, which was earlier referred to as Tuticorin. Apart from that, as you must be aware, the government of India is presently implementing the Sagarmala project in order to facilitate the port-led development in case of India. As part of the Sagarmala project, the government of India is set to develop new major ports, and the criteria which is chosen for the development of new major ports is basically threefold. First and foremost, it is a port saturation. See, some of the major ports in case of India are already saturated with respect to the amount of traffic which it can handle. Take for instance JNPT, it's already saturated and it can no longer handle the additional traffic. Accordingly, the government of India has proposed to create a new major port known as the Vadhavan port. This Vadhavan port will be located in the state of Maharashtra. So already the government of India has given the in principle approval for the construction of the Vadhavan port last year. So accordingly, this is set to become the 13th major port in India. Apart from that, in order to reduce the burden on Kolkata and Haldia port, the government has proposed to create a new major port at Sagar as well. According to the second criteria, the government wants to set up new major ports where such ports are not available. Take for instance, if you look at the central part of Karnataka, in the central part of Karnataka, we do not have any major port and hence the government wants to set up the Belekeri as a new major port in Karnataka. Similarly, the government has also planned to set up a new major port in Tamil Nadu at Kadlur or Sirkazi. The third criteria for setting up of the major ports is to capture the international opportunity by boosting the international trade. And one such port which the government has proposed is the Inayam port in the state of Tamil Nadu. See, all the ports that I have discussed here, they are basically proposed by the central government. Out of all of these proposals, the in principle approval has so far been given only to the Vadhavan port in the state of Maharashtra. With this, we have come to the end of today's discussion. Now, the answers to the questions that were posed before the start of our discussion is as presented on your screen. As far as the answers to question number 9, 12 and 14 is concerned, please find out the answers on your own and respond in the comments section. Now coming to the question for the day, the answer for the question for the day asked in yesterday's DNS is option B.